It's the early 2000s, and in Africa, in Guinea, developers are building a $5 billion refinery. Parliament has agreed to sign off on the project, but the document they need to sign is on a computer in an office in Paris.
We had to download it to print it, and we just couldn't download it.
And so they called a young project manager, Brian Herlihy, to fix that problem.
They actually said, all right, get on a plane, fly back to Paris, get the document, and come back to Guinea.
This connectivity problem is something UN Secretary General Kofi Annan had been talking about for years. He felt that without better access to the internet, Africa would continue to fall further behind the rest of the world.
This digital divide became a real rallying cry for him.
Annan realized that the UN couldn't lay hundreds of thousands of kilometers of cable. They needed the private sector.
The UN was an enabler, convening all the different parties in a very informal way, not to sort of write new laws, but to just allow solutions to flourish.
One of those solutions was a privately funded underwater cable that brought high-speed data to Eastern Africa. And the person who built it is that same Brian Herlihy. The cable went live in 2009, not long after Annan left office.
You could just feel it was drawing the continent in to the global economy.
The challenge for the next Secretary General isn't just how to get data to the global south. It's how to protect the physical and digital networks that the entire world now relies on.
It's probably something which ultimately may last most of the term of a new SG to get from here to there, but it would be a critical win.
Annan's goal was to get the world connected, and it worked. The cables that carry most of the world's data, the shipping lanes that carry its energy and goods, the satellites that keep our financial systems running, they were all built on the assumption that the global economy was something that most actors wanted to protect. But that assumption is now being tested. Our connectivity has created new vulnerabilities, with physical and digital choke points that are exposed as single points of failure. So now, the next Secretary General inherits a different problem. As the infrastructure connecting the world becomes a target for attacks, what can they do to protect it? To try and answer this question, I'm joined by three guests today. We've got Parag Khanna. He's built a career arguing that the world's real map isn't drawn in borders, but it's drawn in cables and pipelines and shipping routes. And the more connected you are, the more powerful you are. We're also joined by Sal Mercogliano. Every week, Sal explains to his 700,000 YouTube subscribers how what happens at sea ends up on your energy bill. And for several months now, he's been covering the Hormuz crisis week by week. We're also joined by Elisabeth Braw. She spent years documenting how states attack each other without technically going to war. She calls this gray zone aggression, and she's got a book coming out this year on undersea warfare. As always, we're joined by my co-host, Mark Malloch-Brown. We just heard him tell the CCOM story, and Mark will be listening in during the roundtable, and afterwards, I get to pick his brain about all the things that have been said and maybe haven't been said. I can't wait for that, so let's get started. Elisabeth, for 70 years, any country that tried to charge ships for the right to pass through an international strait, that counted as a violation of international law. And Iran just did it anyway in the Strait of Hormuz, and it charged over $1 million per ship. And the US is also blocking ships in the Strait of Hormuz. And you recently wrote that this is dangerous not just because of the crisis in Hormuz, but because of what comes next. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's easy to say that why should I care about Hormuz other than the energy prices that it has resulted in. But actually what we are seeing in Hormuz is the latest iteration of something we have seen in different places around the world in recent years, which is countries and entities associated with them violate maritime rules because they think they can get away with it. They want to achieve something that violates that. In order to achieve it, you have to violate maritime rules, and so instead of saying, well, okay, in that case, I'm not going to do it because I have signed UNCLOS, I have signed other treaties, and I will honor my treaty obligations. Instead, countries are saying, well, I don't care. I'm going to do as I wish because this is my objective, whatever it may be, whether it's threatening shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's building artificial islands in the South China Sea, whether it's using vessels that sail outside the official shipping system and cause enormous dangers to coastal states as they do so. If you're that kind of country, you will now say, okay, I'll just do as I wish. And the more countries do that, Jasmin, this is why this matters so much, because the more countries do this, the more countries violate maritime rules, the less incentive other countries have to stick by the rules. Because why should you be the the nice guy, the goody two shoes, whatever word you want to use, if others get away with violating maritime rules? And on top of that, why should you stick to your treaty commitments when actually doing so seems like a disadvantage compared to the other countries that violate their treaty obligations and nothing happens? In fact, they look quite powerful.
So, Sal, you've been covering this week by week, and I wanted to know, beyond the oil price, what are the other systems that have been breaking down the line? So maybe you can tell us about how GPS was affected as well, and what domino effect that had.
Well, the Iranians, following the U.S.-Israeli attack, initiated a lot of disruptions in the GPS, Global Positioning System network. Now, we've seen this happen in the past. Jamming and what's called spoofing is a very common process. Jamming basically takes the normal GPS system and scrambles it so ships cannot navigate using that. One of the things we saw happen toward the end of the 1900s is this transition away from paper charts and celestial terrestrial navigation to the use of electronic navigation. And one of the things that Iran has done is use this to really foul ships' navigation system. So, for example, jamming basically makes the system inoperable. You cannot rely on global positioning system to obtain your exact location, which means ships have to shift back to using, kind of a more kind of traditional method of navigation. Spoofing is probably the one most dangerous thing that is done. That's basically taking the system and just kind of degrading it, or better yet, moving ships around. And that's really dangerous because you may not always know you're being spoofed, which means you may believe you're in a certain position, but you're actually not. And that's really dangerous for ship navigation. That could lead to collisions, could lead to groundings, and especially in low visibility environments. And the Strait of Hormuz is notorious for this with bad weather. I've sailed through it multiple times, and you can get sandstorms, really reduced visibility. And this really impedes your ability to safely navigate. And it's another mechanism that Iran uses to really foul up shipping moving in and out. We've seen high levels of both jamming and spoofing in and around the Strait of Hormuz throughout the Persian Gulf. And that has required ships to be much more careful in their voyages.
So, Parag, most people think of Hormuz as an oil or an energy crisis. What do you think they're missing?
Well, it certainly is an oil and energy story, but that's a subset in a way of the broader global economic and logistical infrastructure that enables global commerce as we know it. It is principally a geography, an immovable geography, a critical one, a choke point, as everyone has now come to appreciate it. And of course, it is has had significant ramifications for energy markets, given how much oil is produced, processed, refined, and then shipped out from now we know sort of north of the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf waters, and that has prevented the outflow, and that's obviously had an impact on energy markets. But now we also appreciate that those very same raw materials are crucial to other industries such as agriculture, to take one example, the production of fertilizers and so forth, and the blockage of the outflow of those critical commodities has major second order downstream impact on agricultural productivity in many countries as well. So this is an energy issue, it's a food issue, and so forth. And let's remember also that we may follow the news sort of crisis to crisis, but for the countries that are actually affected by this, which is many, it really compounds the after effects of COVID, even, which had a significant impact on import of critical goods, and then the trade war prior to the Hormuz crisis, with tariff policies being so unpredictable and importing their capacity to export. So this is the third or fourth in a cascade of whammies hitting many countries in the world. The world doesn't actually neatly reset. Or many countries in the world don't, the way we tend to think when we sort of, treat the world as one discrete crisis after the other. So we should really think about these things in an overlapping, compounding, complex systems kind of way. Not only the different economic domains that are at play, such as food and energy, but also the impact that it has on many of these countries that are suffering multiple crises at the same time, with really no end in sight. And I would just add, even though it's not right on the agenda right now, but climate change, is affecting a lot of these same countries, again, in a chronic way, but in punctuated also by acute, natural disasters. So, for the countries of the world that are suffering from the Hormuz crisis in the most acute fashion, remember that this is one of, 5 or 6 things over the past half decade that has been so destructive to their longer term economic prospects and societal resilience.
Right. And Parag, a lot of your work focuses on geopolitical swing states, so countries like Saudi Arabia, India, or Vietnam. So when they look at vulnerability like Hormuz or other single points of failure, how are they reacting? Are they accepting the risk, or are they building their own workaround?
So it is interesting that resilience is built through developing more optionality for connectivity, for trade routes, more trade partners, less dependencies on a single point of failure. And so this crisis, as what it has in common with previous crises, is that countries on the front lines or countries that are affected do look backwards and learn the lessons and sort of try to find ways to prevent history from repeating itself. So if you take East Asian countries, for example, they have long practiced stockpiling of critical commodities and have been doing so now for several decades. So you've seen, for example, how China, with its stockpiles of petrochemical products and of oil and gas, and even fertilizers, is able to be that swing provider for its Asian neighbors and help them to offset the shock from the supply shock from Hormuz. So that's an example. In general, what countries have been doing, those that can afford to, is building such stockpiles, diversifying their trade partners. Again, COVID was at least an instructive tragedy in this regard, right? We had the same thing happen with COVID, but when it came to pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, and then we learned, well, how do we prevent that from happening? Diversify our sourcing. So similar situation here. Learn to diversify your sourcing if you can. And that's all part, again, of building strategic resilience. But again, it's easier said than done for many countries in the world.
Right. And Sal, I'd love to talk to you about resilience and accountability, because Parag had already kind of mentioned it. Maybe I'll use one example. So in January this year, a Chinese operated ship called the Shenzhen 39 cut a cable off of the coast of Taiwan, and then it just sailed away and it turned off its tracker and pretty much disappeared. And no one was charged, right? So could you tell us what that means when we're talking about accountability for these things?
Well, one of the things that we've seen, I mean, you have that example. We have obviously examples in the Baltic where quite a few cables have been broke by anchor drags and a few other measures. One of the things that we've seen is, how do you prosecute and how do you maintain order on the world seas. One of the things that's been happening over the past few years is really a breakdown in the idea of freedom of the seas. We've seen that from issues in the Black Sea and the Red Sea, and now in the Persian Gulf and in and around the area of the South China Sea. What kind of accountability can be done? Obviously, UNCLOS is the law of the sea. That is the method that we use for enforcement. Now, not all nations obviously recognize that. That's been a very kind of big issue between Iran and the United States in the Strait of Hormuz, since both states do not recognize or have not been ratified UNCLOS at the time. Obviously, enforcement, especially on data cables, is a really important, crucial item because a lot of this does happen outside the territorial waters, out beyond the 12-mile waters of nations. And where is the authority to prosecute and basically regulate that? We've seen in the Baltic, for example, the Baltic states trying to get a handle on that, trying to enforce a lot of targeting of stateless vessels that are sailing without proper registration, without proper insurance and certifications. So we've seen the Estonians, the Finns really executing boardings of ships out in the area. We've seen the Taiwan government working to defend their cables, realizing that that's another form of blockade that can be executed in the attacks against cables against them. We've seen natural disasters where Tonga, for example, was cut off for quite a while because of a volcanic explosion. So I think there's a lot more attention being directed now toward undersea cables. We see a lot of navies bringing ships online to defend those, to monitor them, to put another level of surveillance out there to ensure it. And I think what you saw in the case off Taiwan is a lot more monitoring of vessels, particularly those loitering over cables, to ensure that they can track, and should there be breakages, seizures of the vessels can be taken place and those vessels brought into territorial waters for adjudication.
And Elisabeth, everything that Sal is describing kind of falls exactly into this gray zone aggression that you're focusing on, right?
So I have to say it's very much on my mind, since I have just finished the Undersea War as these incidents were taking place, and so I'm sort of half hoping that there won't be another incident before the book goes to press. But it is another expression of this lawlessness that we are seeing, increased lawlessness that we are seeing on the ocean. So even though it may feel like, to us ordinary citizens, it may feel like it doesn't matter much what let's say China may decide to do in the South China Sea, because we are not affected. It's part of this combined development of countries and entities feeling that they can do as they wish on the oceans, and that really matters, because it is really only the 12 nautical miles that where coastal states have jurisdiction. Everything else, for every other part of the oceans, we depend on those who use that part of the oceans, which is almost everything. We depend on them doing the right thing, following the rules. And if they don't, there's not very much we can do, which is why this is so concerning. And as Sal mentioned, the cable incidents that have taken place so far have mostly taken place outside countries' territorial waters. And I'm pretty sure that will continue to be the case, because if you were, let's say, an extremely sloppy seafarer, or one who may have received instructions to damage an undersea cable, you certainly wouldn't do it in the country's territorial waters, because then that country could intervene, prosecute you, and you would you would face a prison sentence. Whereas if you do it in the exclusive economic zone, you will most likely get away with it.
And adding to that, China just announced in April, as far as I know, that they tested a tool that is capable of cutting armored cables at 3,500 meters depth, which sounds kind of dangerous. So you've already mentioned that there's no proper enforcement mechanism when we're talking about these things that are happening in international waters, right? So what is there?
There isn't very much. Now, I have to reassure people a little bit that cable cutting tool that somehow became a big story. It's not exactly new, and it's also the case that cable repair crews do need to be able to cut off cables in order to get the part that they need to get it onto the repair ship in some cases. So it's not, it may not be as ominous as it sounds, but there are enough ominous developments on the seabed for us to be concerned about. And so what can be done about it? Lecturing to the world's governments that upholding their treaty obligations is a good thing. I think that is the first step. I don't think it will be particularly successful, because we live now in an era of great power politics and great power competition, and why would smaller countries then do the right thing? But then I think another argument to put forward is that eventually everybody will suffer if the disorder on the world's oceans, including the seabed, continues to accelerate, because we all depend on this global commons, right? And you may not care about incidents far from your country, but if lawlessness spreads, everybody will eventually be affected. So that is the speech I would give to the United Nations General Assembly if I had a chance. Uphold international law because it's in your interest.
And Sal, Elisabeth just mentioned it as well, the fact that there is no proper accountability or no proper course of action necessarily. And I wanted to ask you, because 95% of global cable infrastructure is still privately owned. And when a state actor cuts one, there's no insurance for it, no government feels responsible. And at the same time, private repair ships are terrified to sail into conflict zones, or sometimes approval takes ages. So you are our man out on the seas. In your experience, who picks up the tab? Who fixes this?
Well, this really does come to an issue of private shipping and private commerce on this area. We saw this when the Houthis were threatening this back in 2024. They were threatening cutting cables in the Red Sea at the time, and there was issues. We actually had one cable actually get snagged because of a ship at that moment. This is, this has been going on for a long time, not new. We saw this in 1914 when the British fished up German cables in the English Channel and cut them. So this has become a new method. And one of the things that we've been watching is how small states or even non-state actors can play such a role in interdicting trade. The Houthi are probably one of the best examples of that, but we saw how the Ukrainians, with no navy at all in the Black Sea, were able to interdict trade with the Russians. So I think, attacking on undersea cables is the next logical step that we see elements taking place. Obviously, what we see is the issue in shipping is things like war risk insurance. Does areas become much more, costly to sail into? You pay more for your ships going in. Will, cable companies have to do insurance on on their cables and have to be able to insure them through very dangerous waters? Will we have to build more redundancy into our cable system? One of the things we know are there are choke points for shipping, but there are also choke points for undersea cables. Will those nodes become much more vulnerable to potential interdiction and attack? We've seen that with Russian ships sitting over cables off the coast of Ireland and monitoring. I think a lot more visibility is going to have to be done to ensure cable safety. So a new level of protection needs to be done. Do we see ships loitering? Do we see potential areas? But of course, with autonomous vessels and underwater vessels, you may not even see them where they're monitoring and potentially cutting them. And I agree with Elisabeth, the biggest danger is doing it outside the 12-mile limit in the middle of the deep ocean, where there's really no oversight and what jurisdiction plays a role in doing this. This could be the new type of piracy we see, is taking cables hostage and cutting them without a lot of ability to really enforce any action against the perpetrators.
And I'll just add, Jasmin, that there is insurance for cables. For data cables, there is insurance. There is also a repair scheme that operators sign up to. So it's very well set up. It's more difficult for power cables, but the problem is that if you this works under normal commercial conditions, works extremely well, and cable companies have worked it out over the decades. But what happens if what would happen if the situation were to continue to deteriorate, where it's not just commercial considerations and risks facing the cable owners and the repair crews, but geopolitical ones as well, and that is the situation we're approaching.
So, Parag, in 2022, Tonga lost internet for 38 days when a single cable was cut. And the cable was privately owned, just like most of the infrastructure in the world. So what do you think? What would it take to build enough redundancy that a country can't be knocked offline by an anchor drag?
Well, it would obviously need to have more than one cable connection that was taken offline by an anchor drag or by any other kind of hostile act. And this is what we see a fair number of countries doing. If you were to build a time series, of internet cable infrastructure around the world, you would obviously see not only the spaces in between, so to speak, the submarine map, as it were, but of course the junction points and the number of countries or where countries have built them. I live in tiny Singapore, and we have at last count about 38 of them, and I cycle past them in various parts on the perimeter of the island. So here you have one of the smallest countries in the world that is hell bent on redundancy times 38 and probably 45 by the time this podcast is done recording. That's how seriously they take it. So of course, again, not all countries can afford that. There are a finite, as a small number of countries, or maybe quite a few actually, that have still only one cable connection. So that's one way to approach it, is that. But then, of course, let's remember, we could call it leapfrogging for lack of another term in this context. But of course, satellite connectivity, things like Starlink, other ways in which countries are getting connected are also going to be crucial to their redundancy. So whether it's, broadband telecom, satellite, more cables, there's a suite of digital cyber internet connectivity, vehicles or pathways or platforms that countries can look at to ensure their resilience.
If you look at infrastructure holistically, so power, transport, telecoms, water, health, then the world's poorest countries are twice as likely to lose their infrastructure to a disaster than richer ones. And I'm wondering, is anybody doing anything to solve this? Are there plans to alleviate that risk, maybe? And what do you think is the Secretary General's specific role in making that change?
Well, the thing about adaptation to whether it's natural disasters, climate shocks generally, is that adaptation is not a global public good, right? The United Nations has obviously been a leader in promoting climate mitigation, everything from the original IPCC, the Paris Agreement, and so forth. There have been international multilateral processes to try to pool resources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So mitigation of emissions is considered a global public good. But adaptation, meaning prevention or response to natural disasters, is actually a local private good. It is in many ways the sort of, the inverse. And that's problematic because it means that there is not as much global capital available to help countries to combat those disasters. And again, the logic is relatively simple, if brutal, which is that if I build a seawall here off of the coast of my country, it doesn't really help the people far off on the other ocean, right? So adaptation is something that I must finance for myself, and there isn't as much global capital available because the benefits are not felt globally. And we've seen over the past several years of COP summits that yes, adaptation and resilience, A&R, loss and damage funds, and so forth have become more central of a talking point, but that hasn't really resulted in meaningful capital actually sort of coming out the door in order to help countries to cope with shocks, whether it's again shocks from conflict, supply chain disruptions, COVID, and climate. Again, all these compounding risks. So the UN, the Secretary General's office, really has to put a spotlight on adaptation to those risks, any and all risks, again, that emerge from various facets of geography. And I feel that, it is probably not necessarily uniquely the role of the Secretary General, but certainly one of the areas that is a true market failure in the world. And that is certainly one of the critical functions of multilateralism, is to identify and to plug these kinds of global market failures in public goods.
Right. So I wanted to ask Elisabeth, what do you think? What influence do global South countries have on increasing resilience? Because, for example, Nigeria co-chairs the ITU Advisory Board on Submarine Cable Resilience. But I'm wondering, is that a real seat at the table, or is it just a symbolic one? What do you think?
It's better to have a formal role like that than not to have it. But I think we have to recognize that most of the action when it comes to subsea cables, whether it be power cables or data cables, comes from the private sector. So we all benefit from what they produce, which is data connectivity and electricity. But governments just don't own a lot of those cables anymore and don't have a lot of say other than on the regulatory side, giving permission for cables to be buried in their territorial waters and so forth. And so if you look at Nigeria, for example, and other sub-Saharan African countries, when I think about the role they are playing at the moment, it is, for example, the fact that the new cable called To Africa, which is the world's longest subsea data cable, is going really all the way around Africa and then to other countries. So they are getting significant and powerful connectivity. But in terms of policy making, I don't think they can influence a lot. Where we probably will see more activity is in the laying of new cables, simply because there is demand for it in a number of sub-Saharan African countries, and the cable owners, operators go where the demand is.
And I wanted to ask you, Elisabeth, as well, because you recently wrote that the war in Iran, or ending the war in Iran, might be beyond reach for most nations, but that standing together in defense of maritime order is something that they actually could do. So what do you think could make this happen? Do you think it's the Secretary General?
It is the Secretary General, but the upside is that he would have the support of lots of others, starting with the shipping industry, starting with the maritime insurance industry, cable operators, cable owners, offshore infrastructure owners. All of those practitioners depend on maritime order. And by the way, not to forget environmental organizations and all kinds of coastal states and non-coastal states, because we all depend on the maritime order. And in fact, the number of countries and entities that want to undermine the maritime order are the massive minority, or a tiny minority, I should say. It's just that they seem to be setting the tone at the moment. But if all these other entities got together, I think it must be the only situation in which, for example, Greenpeace could team up with, I don't know, Meta and the government of Nigeria. I mean, on which other issue would you have such a coalition and everybody in between? So, led by the Secretary General, it would be a moral issue, it would be a pragmatic issue, it would be a political issue. So I hope he or she will at least give it a try.
Yeah, and I think if we're looking at what this person can do, and I know that looking back at history might be a way to indicate how that person could move forward as well, right? And we do have somebody who knows their history on here, and that's Sal. So I was wondering, Do you know of any historical precedent for an institution that didn't have any or very little enforcement power, where they actually changed how states behaved when it came to infrastructure?
Well, I mean, the analogy I come back to is the stand up of the conventions with everything from safety of life at sea to the marine pollution action. This is the International Maritime Organization under the UN. I mean, I think this is one of the areas that we look at in how we were able to qualitatively change, shipping on the world's oceans. I mean, shipping has become fundamentally safer. We have less accidents than ever before. The scale of the accidents have decreased in terms of that. I mean, marine pollution was such a major one, incidents in the 1960s and 70s with the loss of supertankers. And today what we see is a lot less accidents. Now they tend to be much bigger because of the scale of shipping today and the volume of shipping we do today. And plus, we're much more connected, so we see them much faster, much quicker than we ever have before. But I think that's, to me, is the real issue, because what you're talking about, what Elisabeth's talking about, what Parag's talking about here, is all about this movement on freedom of the seas and the velocity that we move goods. One of the big problems that we have where we see accidents happen and incidents happen is that we're moving goods so much faster, so much quicker than ever before. It's the same thing with data. One of the reasons Tonga is at the end of a line is at the end of a long supply chain. I mean, they're not just at the end of a long cable for supply data, but for supplies in general. And what we see is when there are disruptions, the ends of those cables and the ends of those supply lines are the ones that are usually the most affected. And one of the things that we've seen is that during the global supply chain crisis, building redundancy, building that secondary cables, those tertiary elements, costs money. And unfortunately, underdeveloped countries and areas of smaller, wealth and value and resources tend not to be able to do that. They have to get by with the minimum. So I think International Maritime Organization looking at this, it's very hard to sometimes get the IMO to look at issues until it becomes an issue. But we're seeing that more and more. The IMO has really been pushed. We look at decarbonization on the world seas. This has been an issue that the IMO has grabbed onto. And I think this is another one that we need to be talking about, is cable safety and cable security out there. This needs to be an issue. Everything from unregistered and stateless vessels out there that are causing these issues to which states and which companies are participating in these damages. And I think, to me, that's the step I would want to see: more enforcement, more authority given to the IMO for this ability to oversee it.
And Parag, maybe one of the last questions goes to you. So Sal is making the argument for basically the UN to step in and get more rights for enforcement. And I've just recently watched this talk where you're talking about the future of geopolitics as well, and you talk about globalization, which was really great, by the way. And I remember you saying that globalization is happening, and that's just the way it is. But also, you said that countries will have to find or that regions will have to find solutions for themselves, which doesn't mean that it's anti-globalization or anything. It sounded more like you were suggesting more of a patchwork solution to many of our connectivity issues and vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
So, based on what Sal and Elisabeth and you've been discussing, would you still make that statement now?
Well, it's ironic, obviously, that we're living in a world and we're having a conversation about global connective infrastructures at a time when global governance of those infrastructures seems to be falling apart. So I'm not suggesting or proposing that fragmented governance would be a better way. It's obviously suboptimal. At the same time, what is emerging in other domains like economic and to some degree diplomatic systems is a very clear trend towards regionalism. So certain systems, certain aspects of governance around data privacy rights, for example, you can see this with many within Southeast Asia or within Europe, certain standards that are converging amongst neighboring countries, for example, around data sovereignty, data privacy, location of data servers, and so forth. So that's just an example. And the other truism of the day is not just regionalism and devolution of governance more generally into regional clusters, but also these kind of functional networks. And you're seeing new I don't even want to call them institutions per se, but coalitions, right, that are forming around specific issues. It could be on semiconductors, on critical minerals, on trade. So these are trans-regional, right? They are themselves patchworks. They're extra legal, right? In the sense, again, they don't necessarily have formal legal charters per se. So they are quite literally just functional coalitions. And so one could imagine very plausibly that in matters related to internet cable security, and so forth, that you're going to have more of those kinds of bottom-up, ad hoc kinds of, sort of layers that may just be scope creep or expansion of scope of certain existing groups. Alliance structures could be NATO, could be whatever, but not likely, at the global level.
Okay, so Elisabeth, you wrote that the US was the de facto guardian of international maritime law and freedom of navigation. Do you think they still carry that role? And also, I wanted to ask, how does the next Secretary General kind of find their way or navigate the next chapter of the UN when it comes to our vulnerability with regards to infrastructure?
Yeah, this is the irony, is it not, that the US, despite not having ratified UNCLOS, functions as the de facto protector of UNCLOS, and that has given it a certain amount of leverage over a country like Iran over the years, which has also not ratified UNCLOS, but the US has essentially been the guarantor of the maritime order. That sort of oddity aside, the oddity of it not having ratified UNCLOS itself aside. But what has been happening recently is that the US has seemed less committed to upholding maritime rules. Yes, people will say, because it hasn't ratified UNCLOS, it has the right to violate UNCLOS. And that gets us into a whole other conversation about customary international law, which is too far outside of the scope of this conversation. But anyway, the bottom line is that the US seems to be willingly relinquishing that role, that sort of self-appointed role as the world's maritime guardian. And that is regrettable for all the countries in the world that depend on somebody upholding maritime rules, simply because we don't have an enforcement body. But I think at the end of the day, it's also going to hurt the United States, because if the United States is seen as a country that is not that interested in maritime rules, then other countries won't be that interested in respecting maritime rules when it's in the United States' interest. And this is where we're heading now. And there was an executive order last spring that really, I thought, was quite concerning from the perspective of maritime order. But it's this is where we are, and what I would like to see is whether another country will step up and say, well, somebody needs to be the constable of the global oceans. It's going to be us. The most obvious country would be Britain, which used to rule the waves, as it were. The Royal Navy isn't big enough anymore. Is it going to be China, or is it going to be some sort of loose coalition of intentioned countries? I don't know, but it is regrettable that the United States seems to be not backing out of this role, but giving it up by not partially giving it up by not seeming that interested in rules itself.
And Sal, the last question goes to you. I want to know, if you got to sit down with whoever might be the next Secretary General and you got to tell them on day one, here's what I think you should do or you should be doing, what would your piece of advice be?
Well, I mean, I'd go back to literally the creation of the UN and the precursor to it, where, you had Franklin Roosevelt talking about the issue of freedom of the seas. And, freedom of the seas is not just the ability to sail upon the seas, but to use the seas, to use it both for fishing, but also for undersea cables. And, Roosevelt got that from Woodrow Wilson, who included freedom in the seas in his 14 points coming out of World War I. And when the UN was created, following or at the very end of World War II into the beginning of the post-World War II period, one of the greatest beneficiaries, I will always argue, for the world coming out of World War II was those freedom of the seas that were guaranteed, not just by the United States, but by all the signatories of the United Nations. And, what we saw in the 80 plus years since the end of World War II has been the greatest lift up in global economy and in standards of living across the planet. It's not just developed versus undeveloped. It's the entire world has benefited from this. And I would argue that the challenges to freedom of the seas, both on the surface and below the surface, are there. I mean, we're seeing challenges not just by bad actors, but we're also seeing countries like the United States with its attacks on shipping in the Caribbean, really raising questions about the issue on freedom of the seas. We see Iran, we see the Houthi, we see the Russians and the Ukrainians in Black Sea, we see the Chinese and the Philippines in the South China Sea. We see these challenges. And I would argue again, one of the things that we really would want the United Nations to do is really look at the area outside the boundary of view of nation laws. What can we do? Ian Urbana wrote about the outlaw sea, the lawless sea, and what we're seeing is really a new version of that, a kind of 2.0 version of that, where we're seeing the rise of great powers, of non-state actors, and it has a lot of challenge. And for states that can't really defend themselves, it's really on the onus of the United Nations and the nations in general to kind of work together to do this. What we don't want to see is a return of great power competition on the high seas again, because I think that is a massive step backwards.
And I'll just add, precisely this is what the world's nations tried to get away from for centuries, and they knew that it would be better if shipping and then subsequently also cables and pipelines could operate, and the people associated with them could operate without having to worry about attacks and the like, and operate wherever commerce took them. And it took the world centuries to get to a place where countries could sign a treaty that guaranteed that. And now, it has worked so well. And now the the reality is the world is slipping away from that, which is a massive loss, as Sal said.
Well, on that note, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Elisabeth, Parag, and Sal. And I can't wait to take this apart with Mark in just a bit. Mark, so glad I get to sit down with you here after having all these technical problems in the episode that is about critical infrastructure, and I'm based here out of Egypt. So I'm really glad I get to ask you, what did you think of this discussion?
Well, obviously, infrastructure, the protection of it has quite a few phases to it. In the historic intro to this program, we talked about the importance of developing infrastructure and making sure that digital divides don't open up, that Africa doesn't get left out, for example. But, there's also the role of the UN in, warning when infrastructure is vulnerable, either because the infrastructure is not resilient enough and diversified enough, or because we are we're at risk because the infrastructure is likely victim of too many choke points. There's too much stuff going through too narrow a space, and it gives a country or set of countries a disproportionate hold over trade and energy and other flows. And one of the really interesting things is, before the Strait of Hormuz happened, before it got closed, just in fact more than a year ago, UNCTAD, which is frankly a quite little known think tank of the UN's in Geneva. It used to have a more lustrous past as the sort of voice of the global South during the early post-colonial years. It warned. It said these sea routes are highly at risk, and it had a wonderful set of charts in a report which demonstrated the degree of overconcentration and risk through a handful of these global choke points. But nobody heard. Not only did the world securocrats not hear, and those in the American Defense Department and Israeli forces planning the attack on Iran, but frankly, I don't think even the UN colleagues in New York heard, because the Strait of Hormuz and its closure was a completely sort of unforced error, human error, by military and political planners who just failed to think ahead.
Right. And you know what I found really interesting as well in this discussion was how adamant, especially Elizabeth and Sal, were in their demand for action to restore the maritime order, despite very powerful forces being against that in a way. What do you think? How could a Secretary General do that?
Well, look, the maritime order has, come under several threats lately. I mean, there is a international maritime organization based in London, which was trying to was actually a leading force in trying to stop uh, shipping from continuing to be a climate threat by setting up a whole complex scheme of incentivizing the shipping industry to move away from fossil fuel dependency to renewables. And the Trump administration just jumped on that and absolutely destroyed the political consensus that had arisen for it, threatening delegates that they would lose their right and visas to come to America, that their kids might get thrown out of American graduate schools, and that their countries would be punished in other ways if they voted for it. So, the maritime industry has already been, in a sense, seen the sharp end of major power wrath when it tries to, look after what it rightly sees as its sort of good citizen role. And I think, because maritime trade is absolutely the core piece or the core platform on which the global economy rests. I mean, we sometimes forget that in a world where everything seems to flow digitally, it's that most old-fashioned thing, a ship, which even more, carries the weight of globalization, literally.
Yeah.
And, it's become this industry which has enabled globalization, which is, the free flow of goods, particularly more than, obviously not services in its case. But the costs of shipping have come down so dramatically that whatever you buy that's been imported from abroad in a shop is about, or in a local store, is about a cent on the dollar in terms of, what portion of that has been the shipping and transport cost. And so, that well-oiled machine has allowed this integrated global economy to develop. And if it gets threatened, it is a huge cost, not just to the maritime industry, but to the cost of living globally. Because if we are indeed this trend towards more local supply chains, more resilient, secure alternatives, because we're worried about global geopolitics continues, it certainly disrupts shipping, but it also adds costs and becomes a disincentive to international trade. So, there is a lot at stake for the industry in all of this.
100%. And something else that we couldn't, of course, I mean, the topic is so big that we can't get to everything. But something else that I was thinking about as I was listening to everybody talk was that we were very focused on the cables that are underwater, the deep sea cables. But there's also all the other infrastructure that's around us, the pipelines, the satellites, cloud computing, AI, literally like everything, the health. And so we haven't even gotten to that and how vulnerable that is. And Yeah, I don't know if that's something that's struck you as well, but
Yes, no, well, look, I think so. And, in a sense, common to so many of those systems you just mentioned, is, obviously a technology backbone to so many of those different platforms. But all of them, depend on, AI or software-based platforms, which are highly vulnerable to attack. And, I think, at the moment, it's just the occasional attack. In my country, the UK, various banks have, spent 24 hours or a bit more, in some cases, offline. Several of the big supermarket chains found that their systems were hacked. And so, we've got a small taste of the potential vulnerability. But if the geopolitical trend towards conflict intensifies, and if state actors throw themselves into the asymmetric task, because it's low cost, high return, of disrupting their opponents' economies, we could all learn to live with a much higher assumption of continuous risk. Which of the systems is it this year or this month or this week that's going to fail? Are we going to get stuck on our mass transit systems? Are we going to find that we are forced back to using cash because cash machines have closed down? Well, not cash machines, but digital transfer systems have closed down around the world. And maybe then the cash machines too. So, maybe in this most modern of centuries, we'll be trading goods with each other in order to get some eggs from the supermarket. So, the level of disruption that could occur is huge. And I do think actually, it's the kind of issue where, a Secretary General of the day, could find themselves driving the case for trying to protect civilian infrastructure. I mean, we talked in the introduction about how, in a way, the law of war is developed over many centuries to develop civilians, to protect civilians. It's today, unfortunately, being largely ignored, as we argued. But now, perhaps we're going to see an extension of those kinds of rules and laws and norms, into the era of sector of infrastructure protection, where it remains fair game to disrupt the other side's IT-led drone attacks, but where actually disrupting an old lady going to do, or a pensioner going to do her shopping, becomes not allowed under international law. We're nowhere near there yet. We may arrive at that.
I agree. I agree that people sometimes don't realize how much that boils down to us regular people. And then the last thing I want to talk about, because now we're in episode 6, I think, and something that I've noticed is that we somehow, it feels to me anyway, that we're landing at the same place across the episodes, or similar places, where we're saying, okay, the UN can't, or the next Secretary General can't enforce that many things. There are structures, but they could be better in some places. But what the UN can do, or the next Secretary General can do, is see the whole picture and then bring people to the table and find the smallest common denominator to actually, produce some action that is useful to solve these crises. So, what do you think? Did we actually today make the case for critical global infrastructure? Do you think there was any difference in where we landed today?
No, Jasmine, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think that is the theme that is emerging. I mean, obviously, in some areas like peace and security, there's a well-developed, if limited, set of charter powers that the Secretary General has. But, as we've seen, actually the number of stakeholders and constituencies linked to most problems is growing. It's becoming much more multi-sectoral. You can't solve critical infrastructure without the private sector at the table. You often need non-state actors, whether it's rebel groups or different civil society groups, also at the table. And so, in a way, the lack of instruments and law governing some of these issues at the moment, can be seen as an opportunity for a Secretary General who can move beyond the classic interstate formulas of the law and the UN of 1945 to convene these multi-stakeholder groups and to sort of innovate plans that then can get taken back into the formal UN for codification and turning into an international treaty or something. But he or she has that sort of front-end flexibility to convene and experiment and seek out solutions. And, I think it's a dramatic power in the hands of the right kind of individual.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.